Hello, hello, hello. We are here live again. Bonnie Wagner Stafford from Ingenia Books, and I'm with Yvonne Caputo, author of Flying with Dad, with a special kind of a talk because it is Veterans Day in the United States and it's Remembrance Day in Canada, and it's, whatever the name of the holiday in whatever country, signifying the end of the First World War on the 11th of November at 11:11 in the morning, the armistice. So your book, Yvonne, first of all, hi, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yes, thank you. It's nice to have you again. So Flying with Dad, a daughter, a father, and the hidden gifts in his stories from World War II. I wanted to explore with you some of those gifts. Obviously, the book itself proved to be a gift of sorts for you because of what it did for the relationship between you and your father. And people can find out about that if they're interested in that. But what I wanted to talk about today with you were the gifts, and one of them in particular that has kept coming after you finished writing and publishing the book. And it relates to a story that was published this past week, a feature piece in the Souderton Independent paper. And it relates to your meeting of a gentleman who is now 103 years old. His name is Joe Hahn. Can you tell me what that's all about? Tell me where it started, what happened, and why it's special to you.
Since I knew we were going to talk about this, I was thinking about the chronology. And I'm going to have to go back at some point and see if I can just really pin that down. But what I have done from time to time is I have posted stories on the 467th Bomb Group Association's Facebook page. And I was doing a lot of those in April of this year because they were the 75th anniversary of some of my father's missions when he was at Rackheath. And Rackheath is an air base outside of Norwich in England. And when Dad and I were talking, he mentioned very specific incidents that he was involved in. And so on the exact date, then I would tell those stories again for the 467th. Well, lo and behold, I have in the comment section, Christine White asks me how she can get a book for her 103-year-old grandfather. And I said, of course, why don't you just personal message me and we'll set up something. So she did. And in the process of these back and forth messages, she said to me that probably the easiest way for me to get a book to her grandfather was to get a book to Joe Hahn's daughter, Judy. And so I said, well, where does Judy live? Give me an address. I'll make sure I put one in the mail. So Christine gets back to me and says, well, Judy lives in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Here's the address. Bonnie, Allentown is 16 miles away from me.
Right.
Just get on the interstate and you're up there.
Yeah.
So I'm like absolutely blown away that here's the daughter of this 103-year-old who lives 16 miles away. But then Christine mentioned in a comment that her grandfather was living in a personal care home near to her mother. And I said, what personal care home? And Christine writes back and says, the Lutheran community at Telford. That's 7.2 miles away from where I live. Not only that, but when I was working full time, I would do trainings for the Lutheran community. I know the staff, I know the location, I've been there on, professional business. So how is it possible that this gentleman lives 7.2 miles away from me? So
At this point, did you know the relationship between this gentleman and your father?
Not a whip, not a clue. So I
Tell me
called
about how you discovered that.
I got Judy's phone number and I called her, and I couldn't go visit Joe at the time because of the COVID restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
But I was able to call one of my contacts at Lutheran Community, and she said, you can drop things off. So I called Judy back and I said, listen, I'm going to create a package for your father. I'll put a book in there, a signed hard copy. And she got really excited. Okay. So I did that. And there's an aside to this. She said her dad has difficulty reading normal print. So I thought, how am I going to handle that? Well, I have the author's proof for the large print. So I put that in the package. Judy called me the following morning and said her dad had read 120 pages.
Wow.
Over one night. And of course, here I am, my heart's just a fluttering, and she told me that her father was the assistant crew chief in the maintenance crew at Rackheath. So here I now get the connection that Joe's at the very same airbase as my dad. So my heart's going a little faster. I asked Judy if Joe took phone calls. And she said, oh, yeah. So I called him and I introduced myself. And we had a couple of phone calls until one day, via, again, the granddaughter, I discovered that Joe was the assistant crew chief for a plane called the Wabbit, Wabbit. That was the plane that my father was in when it crashed. Dad was on a training mission, and because of co-pilot error and engine malfunction, the plane ended up in Sir Edward Stacy's alfalfa field, which was right adjacent to the base. So I'm on the phone with Joe, and I said,
now,
Joe,
just a second there. So when people usually hear about a plane crash, it's often, much more tragic than we assume. So your father obviously survived the crash. He broke his leg, I believe.
Yeah. What I knew was when the plane crashed, Dad went up through the escape hatch at the top of a B-24. He slid down to the wing. He jumped off the wing. And when he jumped off the wing, that's when he broke his leg. Right. All of the rest of the crew survived. Okay, so everybody got off just fine. Yeah. So I said to Joe, or I asked Joe, I said, Joe, did you happen to see the plane after the crash? And he said, oh, yeah. He said, there was nothing left of the nose of the plane. It was completely disintegrated. He said, had anybody been in the nose of that plane, they would not have walked away.
Now, the nose of the B-24 is, correct me if I'm wrong, it's where the navigator usually sits, correct?
That's correct.
Your father was a navigator for B-24s.
Correct.
For whatever reason, he was not in the nose that day on that plane.
My assumption is that Dad was up on the flight deck and not in the nose because it wasn't a bombing mission. He didn't need to be calculating anything. So that accident happened on April 27th, 1945. I was born in 1946. So you can well imagine when Joe is telling me this story and he says, had anybody been in the nose, they would not have walked away. Mm-hmm. The breath caught in my throat. It felt like my heart stopped. Here was this guy who's still alive telling me about this miracle that happened to my father those 75 years ago. And what happened is that Joe and I started to have this relationship. I could ask him all kinds of questions about things that I'd never been able to ask my dad about. Some just because I was curious, some just because I had never talked to a crew chief, you know. There were places and stories where he filled in the blanks in terms of how things happened that I would never have known. Mm-hmm. And there was even another miracle on top of all of this. In one of our conversations, I said to Joe, I said, did you ever get close to any of the crews? And I was now visiting him. You know, the Lutheran community had set up a way where I was on this side of the glass and he was on that side of the glass, and we were talking via phone. And I could now see his face. And when I said, did you ever get close? His face registered no. And he said very succinctly, I didn't want to know when they didn't come back. Makes all kinds of sense to me. And then he softened and he said, but there was one crew. And he started to talk about a specific crew member. And the way he remembered it was that this man's name was Stout, Stoudt. And he said he remembers standing on the tarmac as the B-24 was taxiing before it went on this specific mission. And he remembers waving to Second Lieutenant Stout. That plane never came back. So we can get into other miracles that have happened because of the book. But I got on the email and sent an email to a man by the name of J. Peter Horn, who is the archivist and historian for the 467th Bomb Group. And I said, could you locate and tell me what happened to that crew? And Peter got back to me and said, there's no crew named for Stoudt. However, see if you can find out other names. So I called Joe back and he gave me two more. And I gave those names back to Peter. And what Joe wasn't aware of is that there was a crew person, but it was Staudt. And he wasn't the pilot of the plane. He was the co-pilot. And during the Second World War, crews were named by the pilot. And what Peter was able to give me was the following. I don't remember the exact date, but that crew experienced flak. And the plane started to go down. And the navigator on that flight didn't make it. But all of the other 9 crew members were able to bail out. Some of them were able to evade German capture for days or weeks, but they all eventually ended in POW camps. However, when the Allies came through and freed the men in those camps, all of them returned home. And Peter went on and did some incredible research. What he shared with me was what all happened, the people who came home. And he literally sent me pictures of their grave sites, which gave clear indications that all of these men lived far into the future before they passed away. So on one of my visits, my very next visits, I took all of that information to Joe. And he read through it. And he just looked up, just a little bit of mist in his eyes. And he said, it's just so good to know after all these years.
Yeah, that is really, so that's a gift that you received that then you were able to pass on to Joe Hahn. I want to just digress a little bit, or it's not really a digression, but it's Veterans Day, it's Remembrance Day, it's why we're having this conversation. In Ottawa today, Canada's nation's capital, they planned a Remembrance Day ceremony that was different from any other, because there were not going to be any veterans there. I'm recalling this from listening to the news this morning, so I might get some details wrong. But so the first time that there would not be veterans there, two reasons. One, because of the pandemic, and it's too risky to have these senior citizens gathering, even though they were preparing for social distancing. But two, there are fewer and fewer of these people left. 75 years ago, as you said, was the end of the war, which means, the people who fought in World War II are in their 90s or older. Mm-hmm. And so Remembrance Day, Veterans Day, the memories, the gifts in the memories, this is all leading to a question. What does it mean to you to be looking into these details and making these connections and learning about what these men went through and sharing what they continued to go through even when they came back home after the war was over, which is really what your book is about, is, what happened to what did your dad bring forward even after the war was over?
Well, one of the major purposes I had in writing the book too, was I wanted my reader to get a sense of the day in, day out life of an individual GI, an ordinary GI. We know about big battles, we know about the major players, but who were these ordinary guys? So that was one thing. That was a purpose behind writing the book. But even more, to spread the idea that we who are sitting here right now have freedoms that we take for granted because of what those men and women did for us those 75 years ago. And you mentioned what my dad came back with. He came back with what would now be diagnosed PTSD. For 3 solid years, he had the same nightmare. Not every night, over and over and over again. And when I was working on the book with him, he opened up and told me what that nightmare was. And it was so bad. Now, I'll give you a little bit of the nightmare. The plane is going down. In the dream, my dad needed to get from his position in the nose of the plane through a little passageway to the bomb bay so that he could bail out. And in the dream, the passageway on both sides had stainless steel. And Dad said there was no way that he could get purchase, that he could pull himself through. Now, he always woke up. He always woke up before the dream ended. But he said to me that he literally clawed huge holes in the mattress to the point where they really had to get rid of the mattress and buy a new one. And when Dad and I were talking, because I'm a psychotherapist and because I've done a lot of study about trauma, I said to him, well, you know, Dad, what makes me so sad is that at the end of the Second World War, they didn't know what we know now. And what we now know is that nightmares, like the ones you had, are a normal reaction to the abnormal experience of the horrific things that you saw. They were in an unpressurized plane, 22,000 feet above the ground, 40 degrees below zero, depending on heated suits and oxygen masks. And so
and they were being shot at.
And they were being shot at, and these incendiary bombs were going off everywhere around them and staying in tight formation. They couldn't bob and weave. And then they had Messerschmitts, the German, I don't think that we can realistically understand how frightening that must have been. But they just kept going and doing it because that's what they were dedicated to do. So even translating to Joe, for Joe to have this, I'm no longer a stranger, but to have this person just to talk about it, just to say, I'm here to witness what you did for me.
Yeah.
So being, being able to give back to this guy is like an ongoing gift. And on a kind of fun note, he loves oatmeal raisin cookies. And so one of the things I wanted to do in retirement is I wanted to be the little old lady that all the kids would come and see, because I would have cookies and milk and we would sit out on the back patio and talk a lot. Well, there are no kids in our neighborhood. But now I get to bake cookies. Only all of my cookies either go to Joe and other residents that are at Lutheran or to my neighbors. Because there's no way I'm going to have 6 dozen cookies in the house for Kirk and I. I'm just not doing it. So it's the gift again for me is how I've been able to build relationships. I'm going to meet his daughter for the first time today.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I'm just going to wrap it up here. And get any final words from you. But so speaking for myself, Remembrance Day, my father didn't fight in the war and his father didn't fight in the war in either of the wars. One, in the First World War, my grandfather was still in Russia. And by the time he came to Canada and the Second World War came around, he was from Russia with German heritage and he was a farmer. So A, it was essential service. B, he had to report on a regular basis because he was considered, I don't know what the term is, but, had ties to an enemy country at a certain point. Anyway, I don't know the details of that. And my father was a child in the Second World War. So I didn't have any direct family connection to what Remembrance Day meant. And so it was like, oh, well, it's a day off work or a day off school and then as a reporter covering the stories and the poppy wearing and all of that. But this, you have an opportunity and you have taken advantage of that opportunity to really provide some meaning and you are acting, you are walking the talk of why we have Veterans Day and Remembrance Day, which is, let's not forget what these people did so that, as you said earlier, we have the freedoms and liberties that we enjoy today. So thank you for that, and do send my blessing to Joe and his daughter when you see them later today. Any final thoughts just before we wrap up?
Just to put emphasis to what you said, that Veterans Day here and Remembrance Day in Canada means something. And there's going to be a day in the not too distant future where we're going to get the news report that not one of these people who fought for us is still alive.
Yeah.
So in particular, it is crucial. It felt crucial to me to bring that story alive. But we also need to remember that it's not just World War II.
Right.
We have veterans from Vietnam, from Korea. We have veterans from the Gulf Coast War.
Oh, yeah.
Right. We have men and women who have done what they saw as their duty so that we could continue to live the lives that we do.
Yeah.
Incredibly rich lives.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you once again for joining us. I have posted in the comment section a link to your page on the Ingenium Books site. Just a poignant reminder that, writing a book that means something to each author is, it's always a bigger issue. There's always more at play. It's like, oh yeah, I wrote a book. Yeah, great. Actually, but it means something. And so it's such a privilege to be able to participate in journeys like yours.
Well, I have said, and this can be my final remark.
The final.
The final is that it feels like my entire life was a journey to write this book. That I went to college, that I had a history professor that just taught me to love history, that I taught and learned how to be a verbal storyteller, that I went on to get a degree in psychology, that I had this skill set that allowed my father to open up in these incredible ways so that this book is now out on the market. That's a pretty incredible thing to be able to look at one's life in that respect.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Well, much gratitude as always. Thank you very much for sharing the story, and happy Veterans Day, Remembrance Day. Celebrate your family members as it makes sense based on their contributions or how you benefited. Mm-hmm. So thank you, Yvonne. Until next time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.